It's a small thing. Okay, so today we are talking about perception. And again, I mean, so the reason we're talking about perception is because we're talking about sound and music. And the reason that we're talking about them from a signal processing perspective, but the reason that they're interesting signals is because we listen to them. And so we need to, we can't escape the human factor, the listener, in this system. When I first started in graduate school, I was really interested in music, and I was working in this group that was called the Experimental Music Studio at MIT. But I was coming from an engineering undergraduate, and so I was interested in machines and very, very wary of people and biological systems and stuff like that. But my first project was working on a sound synthesis technique, and I quickly realized, I quickly came up against this, that well, how do I decide whether I'm using my time well or whether I'm wasting my time? I make some changes, it sounds different, but I can't measure that, I can't quantify that. And so that really cemented for me the idea that you have to have some interpretation of the listener when you're thinking about these kinds of processing, these kinds of systems. Now, even when you recognize that, it doesn't make it that easy, because human beings are very complicated systems, and so our understanding is not complete. And as I'm trying to, if the original problem I had was trying to make a music synthesis algorithm that sounded good, that's still a very, very much an open question. But we can at least talk about what people do know and how people try and approach these questions. So we'll talk a little bit about the physiology, that is the actual anatomy and the visible biological structures in the ear. Talk about psychophysics, which is how you study people's perceptions from a psychological point of view by running experiments, seeing how the organisms react under different experimental conditions. Talk briefly about the specific issue of pitch perception. It's been very heavily studied and speculated about, but it's still somewhat mysterious how we decide that a particular sound is a A440 or whatever. And a little bit about music perception. So each of these, well, physiology, psychophysics, and music perception are all, complete fields unto themselves. And so to sort of talk about them, in a few slides is, again, kind of an insult. But that's what we're going to do, all the same. So hopefully we'll get something. Okay, so the ear, our ears, and the ears of other mammals, and then the pressure wave sensitive organs of other animals, they are incredibly effective and sensitive and highly developed sensory organs. Eyes are pretty good too, maybe even better. But although we're less conscious of our ears, but they are, incredible structures in their own rights. So we've talked about acoustics. We understand that the whole thing about sound is these pressure waves traveling through air in the case of sound in response to vibrations far away. But there are, it turns out the actual pressure variations that we hear are very, very slight. If you were evolving an organism that was going to try and get information from its environment based on sound waves, you could have something which is, a fairly crude, like a pressure sensor, something that tells when you bump into something, and then maybe you could make that a little more sensitive so it would tell if there was a sound pressure wave. But over, millennia of evolution, this thing has become so sensitive that actually the pressure variations that we can hear are maybe an order of magnitude over the Brownian noise, that if they were much more sensitive, then we just hear this continuous noise just from the air molecules bouncing against themselves. So they're pretty much as sensitive as they could be, which is why now we can build artificial things to do these same kind of jobs. We can build microphones which can pick up signals. But microphones have a hard time doing much better than the ear. because there isn't a lot of noise floor that you can get. The only thing you can do with a microphone is you can focus energy more effectively. So you can make a microphone more directional, which means that you can, these shotgun mics are able to pick up sounds that, typically, because you can exclude surrounding noise and focus in a particular direction, you can make things audible that wouldn't otherwise be audible. But, it's not, that's a very tricky game to play. So our ears are pretty good, at least when they're working. Of course, when we damage them, they become less good. But in the best cases, they're very good. What they do is they collect the pressure waves, and then they have this thing here, the cochlea, which basically is a mechanical neural device. It converts the pressure. The middle ear is just to sort of do some impedance matching. Then the cochlea converts the mechanical pressure waves into nerve firings, which then, in this cartoon of mine, goes into some specialized parts of the brain. The lower, more functionally organized parts of the brain are called the midbrain, and then the higher, more kind of human-specific, abstract brain processing is called the cortex. So that's kind of what's going on. This is, you can sort of see what it's doing. People have been cutting cochleas apart, doing dissections on ears for a long time. And although probably it wasn't until, I don't know, there's this guy, von Beckersey, who was working in the mid-20th century, who is credited with sort of explaining the basic function of the cochlea. So it wasn't until relatively recently that actually I guess Helmholtz in the late 19th century sort of figured out what it must be doing, how you can build one of these. But it's relatively recent that we've understood this, but we're still trying to understand the details of how it works, how it manages to be so sensitive, how it manages to have such a wide dynamic range. But this has been studied extensively. This stuff is harder to study because you have to basically have a working ear-brain system and be able to record individual nerves, know what's going on. But there has been a fair amount of work done in not humans, but mammals like cats and ferrets are popular models for this. But it's messy stuff. And then, of course, what goes on here is extremely difficult to analyze. Again, there is some data. In fact, there's these amazing experiments they do when people have very bad epilepsy. There's sometimes you can have surgery to try and figure out what it is that's going wrong with your brain. You get these sort of these dysfunctional neural firing patterns in your brain. And so some epilepsy patients will actually have electrode arrays implanted in their brains and to record the data for like a few days to see if they can figure out where the problems are arising. I don't know what they do with that information, but that's what they do. And so sometimes if someone's having an epileptic patient who has some problems near to their auditory centers, then they'll put some of these electrodes down, and then people can record the electrical activation from an array of sensors, like 256 electrodes, near the ear. And then these guys in UC San Francisco, Eddie Chang and Nima Mesgarani, they got some of these patients with the electrodes in their heads, and they played them some sound, did some auditory experiments on them. And so we have these recordings of what the brain is actually doing in response to what the cortex is doing in response to sound. But it's very, very sparse data for a very complex system. So we're just at the very beginnings of understanding that. But that's kind of where we are. So looking at the part that we understand the best, the ear. I mean, this is a mixture of a straight acoustic system and the sort of neural system. So roughly speaking, the sound pressure out here, it gets collected by this horn. Then there's a little membrane here, the eardrum, which converts the air into some mechanical motion. There are these bones, and then there's the cochlea, which converts the mechanical motion into the nerve firings. There's this really nice video, which was put together by this guy, Brandon Pletsch. He's actually, his thing is just a medical illustration. So he put this together more or less as I think it was like some kind of final project for some class he was taking on animations to explain medical things. But it does a nice job of explaining this. So I thought we'd just watch this. It's like 6 minutes long, and it basically the visualizations are pretty useful for understanding this.